All right, welcome back to the brighter side of blue. Obviously, this is a little different than what you're used to. And the silliness is taped on Thursday nights now. You can find it on YouTube on our live channel. If you go to our YouTube channel and just click on live, it's there, and it's also on our Facebook page. So we're going live on every Thursday. Last Thursday, we talked about the Mount Rushmore of St. Louis gangsters. So we had fun with that topic, several other topics, and our typical silliness. We had a lot of fun. This Thursday, we are going to do the most memorable slash horrific single crime in the St. Louis that we can remember, or we're doing some research and come up with some, and we'll talk about those this Thursday. And we're looking forward to having a guest. We haven't finalized that guest yet, but it's probably somebody from a previous show that you might want to ask questions to. So we'll update that. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, and we'll be updating that definitely on YouTube and Facebook on who the guest might be this week. But again, we appreciate all the support, and just keep liking, subscribing, and sharing, and that's what we ask of you. And we'll keep trying to put out good content and have a lot of fun along the way. And I think we're doing that. But we really appreciate all the support. We appreciate the support from our sponsors, Columbo's Cafe and Tavern, where we are on every Thursday night, Riverman Cigar Company, Fairway Automotive, Schicker Automotive, and then Corey Campbell at Campbell Security Group. And we really look forward to gaining more sponsors as we go along the way, and doing some different things. Going to put more content out as we go. But this week, to get to we're with Mike Fagan. Did an interview with Mike. There is no video on the interview. I do have some, I put up some different pictures and different things that we found in the files and what people have sent us along the way that you might find interesting. And those will play for the first 5-10 minutes, and then there'll just be one picture the rest of the way. But yeah, I had a good time with Mike. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this. It was a lengthy interview. It was about an hour and a half long. As you know, the trial went 7.5 months. So it wasn't real easy to wrap that up in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So, and Mike, you've heard his name. Scott Rosenblum mentioned his name, and, he's just a meticulous attorney. And, he came when I asked him to do it. Actually, Tom Murphy set it up. And when he asked him to do it, he agreed to it. He came with a bunch of notes and really recollect his memory, and he really lays it out nice of exactly how this all went down. And it's a historical case, so there's a lot of pieces that had to be put together because they're going over crimes for 10 years that happened, and they're putting that puzzle together. And it's interesting how it all got together and how it culminated in that 7.5 month trial. And I think they got 7 out of 9 convictions, and he talks about all that. So, again, join us this Thursday on our live show. Follow us on our social media platforms, and like, subscribe, and share. And I hope you enjoy the interview with Mike. See you next week. Peace. With us today is Mike Fagan, and we are going to talk about the Jerry Lewis-Bey case. Some would known as the longest trial in St. Louis history, one of the first RICO cases. I believe Mike said it's the second RICO case that went through the state of Missouri. And Mike was the prosecutor in the case with a lot of other people. Mike headed the prosecutorial team, I guess we should call it. Huh, Mike?
That's probably a fair statement, yeah.
Because there was a lot of people involved that helped, correct?
Yes, there were. On the attorney side, it was me and Dean Hogue, longtime assistant U.S. attorney, and Dan Muehlman. We were the 3 attorneys who handled the trial, and I did a lot of the work prior to trial, and Dean got involved a little later, and then Dan got involved just before the trial started. And of course, we had a lot of police and some DEA people as well involved in the investigation. They did a terrific job, and I can mention them now.
Yeah, we'll get into that as we go, but one of the things I found interesting when we were talking before is give a little background on how you started in the circuit attorney's office, but this case kind of got in your attention well before it started.
Well, at least some of the people involved in the case got to my attention, and the movement of Jerry Lewis and his use of a quasi-religious group called the Moorish Science Temple of America as kind of a front for his activities came to my attention. Early on, I was an assistant circuit attorney from 1977 to 1982. And I don't remember the exact year, but at some point, I'm going to guess it's around 1980 or 81 or so, a uniformed patrolman of the St. Louis Police, I believe was John Green, came to the warrant office when I was working in the warrant office to seek charges against a guy who had the last name of Kirksey. That guy had been arrested by Green for drugs and or weapons. I can't remember if the weapon was involved, but there were clearly drugs involved. And Officer Green, during the warrant application, said, there's something interesting about this. And I brought it along, and what's that? I said, and he said, this guy had a briefcase with him when I arrested him, and I looked through the briefcase, and he had all these notes and papers in there that had a lot of coded language and some figures and things, and there's something called a Circle 7 on there, and just different things that were unusual. And he said, I wondered what it was. He said, I kind of stayed up all night trying to decipher and decode what it was all about, and he actually had decoded some of it. You could tell it had something to do with drugs and with people that he was involved in the drug game with. And again, it all tended to have something to do with this organization called the Moorish Science Temple, which I really hadn't heard much about before that. So after he left, at some later point, I kind of looked into what police might have known about either Kirksey or his associates that were indicated in those papers, and whether the Moorish Science Temple was being used in St. Louis anyway as some kind of a front for criminal activity, and found some interesting information that made it appear that that was the case, but not much happened at that point beyond that, and it was just one of those things that I kind of filed away in the back of my mind. But eventually the case got assigned to me, and I remembered some of those earlier things from way back in the early 80s. You immediately remembered
that?
Oh, sure. They wanted to say, well, what are some of the important cases we want to develop and try to investigate? And I think there are 3 or 4 cases that were named as the initial OCDF cases, and this Jerry Lewis organization was one of them at that time. It wasn't assigned to me. Different AUSAs had the case at that time, and they were, I guess, hopeful that, and if I remember right, ATF and maybe FBI and maybe DEA, whoever was doing the investigation, I think they were approaching it thinking, like with a lot of drug investigations, if we just develop enough evidence to make a big seizure, or maybe develop an informant who'll make a buy, something like that, and develop a case that way. And because of the level of violence involved with this group, nobody was willing to become an informant. The case didn't go anywhere, and they conducted various investigatory steps, getting toll records and things like that, but they never had enough evidence to do a wiretap, or they didn't have informants or anything like that. And the case kind of didn't go anywhere for a long time. It got handed from one AUSA to another over time, and again, it was open on paper, but not much was happening. Finally, when one of the AUSAs who had the case, if I remember right, was being nominated to become a magistrate judge, it was time to change their assignment to the case to somebody else. And if I remember right, it was Tom Dittmar, was U.S. Attorney, and he said, Fagan, do you want to do this? And I said, yeah, I know something about this. And I was kind of looking forward to it, because I had always thought that the case was being approached a little differently, needed to be approached a little differently than it had been, and at a kind of historical look at all the various arrests and incidents over the years would help develop the case, and we could find people who could be prosecuted that way, and maybe they would turn into witnesses. And kind of that's actually what happened. We put together a lot of information over a period of time, and pulled all kinds of old police reports, and there were a lot of police officers involved getting all the reports and organizing information, and it took months and months to go over all that stuff, but that's how the case developed.
And I think we talked to Harry Hager, who was the commander of the homicide division at the time when this thing really took off, and he assigned 2 very, very good seasoned investigators in Frank Banasak and Bob Dwyer at the time. And Frank later retired, and Bob went to DEA as an agent. Correct. And when Bob went to DEA as an agent, he obviously stayed involved. And then I believe who was also involved was Sal Sierra, of course, legendary narcotic investigator / supervisor, and Donnie Mandrella from DEA.
Correct.
And I think when you say that they got all these reports together and all the knowledge that they had, and you also had guys behind the scene like a Larry Plyman, and when you would hear these reports, you would put all this together, and that's what you did for a while, right, Mike?
Right. They again, Sal Sierra and Bob Dwyer and Don Mandrella, as I recall, were actually kind of working a prior investigation on what was called, for lack of a better term, the Noble Bennett organization. Noble Bennett, being a big heroin dealer at the time, had a lot of people working with him and for him, apparently. And they actually developed enough case to get an indictment in that case, enough evidence, I should say, to get an indictment in that case. And shortly after they got the indictment in that case and made arrests of a number of people, one of the persons, a guy named George Noel, and then a little around that same time, another guy named Earl Parnell, both decided to cooperate and came forward. And those people both had some things to say, of course, about the Noble Bennett organization, but they also had a lot of things to say about the Jerry Lewis organization. And at that time, the Noble Bennett organization was kind of drying up. It didn't have access to drugs like it once did. And so Noble Bennett, as it turned out, was pulling himself toward Jerry Lewis and rejoining. They'd been involved in drugs many years before, but they rejoined kind of, and Noble got involved with Jerry's organization at that time. And at around the same time is when the case wound up getting assigned to me. And again, Sal Sierra, Don Mandrella, Bobby Dwyer, Frank Banaszak, and then you mentioned Larry Plyman and also Mike Duker all got involved in pulling together reports and doing further investigation. Larry O'Toole, who was at the time, I think, a detective, later on kind of rose up in the department to be assistant chief, but Larry O'Toole was briefly involved in the case as well at that time for a while, and all were involved with various investigatory steps to put the case together.
So as you guys connect the dots from the Noble Bennett investigation into the Jerry Lewis organization, as you're getting all that information together, you guys make a move to further the case, and what happened during that?
Well, there was just a lot of behind-the-scenes work, I guess, going over all the various police reports. Took a lot of time, and organizing it all was kind of Larry Plyman's responsibility. He did a terrific job. Anytime he would have the reports for me to take a look at, and I would see things in the reports like, oh, we're going to need these records or these phone tolls or something from the Department of Revenue to prove this car was assigned to this person, all kinds of kind of little things like that. But if you put all that stuff together, you can make a good case out of it, and that's what we had to do. So they were involved in tracking down a lot of records and putting things in folders. It was kind of before computers and electronic evidence, and so there's a lot of paper involved, and organizing it all was a big challenge. Making lists of things to do. I know Sal would be frustrated when he'd get what he called another Fagan list, because I'd make a list of, we need to talk to these people, we need to go out and find these records, etc. And then he was kind of the head of the team, so to speak. And
the street team, I guess you want to call it.
For lack of a better term.
Right.
And he then would say, well, Frank, you need to do this, or Bobby, we need to do this. And they'd go out together and either interview people or conduct further investigation of locate records or further reports. There were things in a lot of places around the country that we had to track down records from time to time. There was, for example, as we'll talk about at some point, the Jerry Lewis group was involved in a whole bunch of murders. Right. And Jerry, in one of the occasions, for example, was that Jerry kind of dummied up an alibi. So when one murder happened, he claimed, or had friends claim, that he was in Washington, D.C. at the time. And so we went to look at the hotel records to see if Jerry really was there. And of course, we knew he wasn't, but we wanted to get the records that were created, and there were hotel records that had obviously been forged. They didn't have his true signature on there and things like that. And so Frank Banaszak and I actually went to Washington, D.C. to do that. And in order to get the records, the hotel wasn't cooperative at first, so we had to write out a grand jury subpoena So we actually went to the Supreme Court building. I had a blank grand jury subpoena
New
with
York?
me. No, in Washington D.C., the
Washington,
Supreme
I'm sorry,
Court
yeah.
of the United States. And in the lunchroom of the Supreme Court, we wrote out a grand jury subpoena to this hotel. And as far as I know, it's the only grand jury subpoena ever issued out of the Supreme Court of the United States. And we took it to the hotel and got the actual records we needed that way. We also interviewed a witness up there. And so there's just a lot of behind-the-scenes work that was
So
interesting.
you get all that done, and then your next step is to do arrest warrants and search warrants.
Yeah,
And how
yes.
many of those guys did you do? Or how many search warrants do you?
That's a great question because it's been so long I don't remember the exact number. We indicted 15 people, and there were another 9 people I think that were named in the indictment as unindicted co-conspirators. And then at the same time, when they went out to arrest people based on the indictment, they also conducted a number of search warrants. And again, from memory, I'm guessing it was anywhere between 10 and 20. I just don't remember the exact number.
Right.
But it was they covered a lot of places. Some of the residences were things associated with the defendants, or sometimes it was with their relatives, a sister or a brother or things like that, where we knew evidence was likely to be and usually was. They didn't recover a whole lot of drugs in the search warrants, but they did recover a lot of guns, a lot of documents. Jerry Lewis and his group ran a couple of different stores. The main one was called the Family Market up in North St. Louis, and one of the search warrants at the Family Market recovered just kind of an extraordinary amount of paperwork and invoices and things like that, and all kinds of drug notes were kind of concealed in all that information, and so we recovered a lot of documentary evidence.
But you later found out you didn't. You left
Yeah.
something at that market.
Correct. At that night, the way they went out and arrested people in the evening and conducted search warrants was usually at night. The weather was extremely cold, and there was ice and snow on the ground, and it was just kind of a miserable night to be out doing anything, much less police work. But they were out there doing that kind of police work and doing a great job and risking their lives in these places. When they did the search warrant at the Family Market and seizing all this documentary evidence and some weapons, as I recall, as well at the market, one of the things you do, of course, in a search warrant situation is try to be thorough. And there was an access door to the attic up in the ceiling, and so one of the officers lifted up that and kind of looked up there in the attic and thought there's nothing here to look at, and came back down very quickly. Plus, it was cold. Like I said, they'd been out all night doing these arrests and search warrants. And so much later on, after we had cooperators in the case, we found out that there were $400,000 that had been stored in the attic that the police missed. And it's just one of those unfortunate
Sure, it
things.
later helped for his defense fund.
Yeah, we think that's what happened to it. That's exactly. Yeah, Jerry's wife and one of the other guys' wives or girlfriends, I think, we had information that they went and recovered that money and turned it over to the defense lawyers.
So when these guys that get indicted, guys and gals get indicted, you guys arrest them, and obviously they go to various prisons all over. But that's when the case really starts to kind of gain some more momentum, and talk a little bit about that.
Before the indictment came down, the case kind of was a historical case. We had a lot of these incidents with drug possessions, weapons possessions, and some information about some of the assaults and murders, but we couldn't prove a lot on the assault and murder part at that time. But we had George Noel and Earl Parnell as cooperators who were willing to testify about some of those things. And we thought, well, with all this historical information that'd be presented primarily through police witnesses and these 2 cooperators, we think we have enough to indict and hopefully get a conviction out of this. So we did indict. After the indictment came down, fairly promptly after that point, one of the named defendants, a guy named Rudy Weaver, also you could hyphenate his name, put E.L. after that, Rudy Weaver E.L., through his lawyer, he said he wants to cooperate, and we got to debrief him, and he had a tremendous amount of information, had been actively involved with Jerry many years before, but then went off to Kansas City and sold dope in Kansas City kind of independently for a while, but came back to St. Louis and rejoined with Jerry for the past couple of 2-3 years prior to the indictment, and again, had a lot of good information, including he'd been trusted enough by Jerry to know who the source of supply for the cocaine was. A guy named, they called Johnny. His true name was Juan Alfaro Gonzalez. Mm-hmm. And so Rudy was willing to and did make recorded phone calls to Johnny, and they talked on the phone, and Johnny, in those conversations where he didn't realize Rudy was cooperating, Juan, or Johnny, talked about Cisco, which was a nickname that Jerry Lewis used when he dealt with Johnny, and they talked about as if Cisco was still on the street, still dealing in drugs, because Johnny didn't know that this indictment had come down, and Rudy was just making the arrangements for Cisco, or for Jerry Lewis, as far as Johnny knew, and Johnny agreed to bring up 4 kilos, and in fact did bring up 4 kilos of cocaine, and the police were able to figure out where he was and track him, and he got stopped over on the east side, and they found the 4 kilos in a hidden compartment on the underside of his car that he'd used all kinds of sealant underneath to kind of hide it, but they found the 4 kilos, and Juan Alfaro Gonzalez got charged with that. Later on wound up pleading guilty in the Southern District of Illinois, but he agreed to cooperate right away when they first found the 4 kilos, and he again also gave us a lot of information. So fairly soon after the indictment came down, we had George Noel and Earl Parnell to be our testifiers, plus then we had Rudy Weaver, and now we had Juan Alfaro Gonzalez as well to tell the story. Shortly before the indictment came down, a separate incident occurred where a guy named Kerry Caldwell got arrested with a weapon. He was a felon, so he shouldn't have had a weapon. He got arrested, and in probably 2 months or so before the indictment came down, we were able to talk to him, and he had been involved with Jerry and the gang as well, and he told us a lot of information about various shootings and drug deals, and he made some recorded phone calls. Again, this is pre-indictment, to a guy named Michael Shepard, also known as Michael Shepard Bey. Shepard's calls incriminated him, so that after the indictment came down and Shepard realized that, there are recorded calls with him talking about being involved with Jerry, the group, eventually Shepard came to us as well and agreed to cooperate and testify. Still sometime after that, if I remember right, at some point along there, Ronnie Thomas Bey, just known as Ronnie Thomas, through his lawyer, came to us and decided to cooperate.
That's after he was sitting in jail for a little bit?
Yeah, after a little bit.
Okay.
And then also after sitting in jail for a fairly long time, Jerry Lewis's brother, Michael Lewis, through his lawyer, came to us and said, Michael wants to cooperate. So he became a cooperator as well. So we had several different cooperators willing to testify about their involvement with this Jerry Lewis organization and all the people involved in it.
Give us a little bit about Ronnie Thomas Bey and his background.
Ronnie Thomas was Jerry Lewis's cousin, and so they went way back, obviously. And Ronnie had been involved with Jerry in drug trafficking and independently involved in some drug deals as well for decades. Jerry got convicted in federal court of drug trafficking in 1972 and was sent to, I'm not sure how many different prisons, but at one point was in Milan, Michigan, a federal prison there, and did some time, was paroled. Later on in 1977, his parole was revoked. He did another year in Milan, and so while Jerry was in the joint, as they say, Ronnie would independently sell drugs. But when Jerry got out, he had somehow learned about and become interested in the Moorish Science Temple movement while he was in Milan, Michigan prison. So he came out and in autumn of 1979 incorporated the Moorish Science Temple of America in the state of Missouri and kind of assumed the leadership role, calling himself the Grand Sheik of the Moorish Science Temple. He did, in the incorporation papers, it was him, it was a guy named Garland Rush, and a woman named Rita Gatewood, and they stayed involved over time. The latter two, I can't say we had a lot of information about them being involved in criminal behavior, although Garland Rush, later on we got more information about that. But clearly Jerry was involved in drug trafficking after he got out in 1979. And at that time, there was a heroin substitute that was popular in St. Louis called T's and Blues. T stood for Talwin, which was an antihistamine, and blues, or maybe I'm backwards on that. Blues were some other, maybe that was the antihistamine. But anyway, there were two different kind of pills that people would crush or cook down in some kind of way and inject it, and it gave a heroin-like high, is my understanding. And it was very popular, particularly in the north side of St. Louis, and it was a big deal. And Jerry Lewis and other people working with him were big teas and blues dealers. One of the people who got involved early on at that stage, back in say 1981 or so, was a guy named Carlton Darden. Darden, I can't remember, either was related to Jerry Lewis or by marriage may have been related to Jerry Lewis, but he was caught with guns and teas and blue in his car back in January of 1981, and that was just like one of the incidents where, when we look back at all these police reports, when we were in the late 1980s, early 1990s, looking at all those reports, we could look things up like that. So, oh, here's an incident where Carlton Darden had some teas and blues. It's given the time frame and his relationship with Jerry Lewis, that seems like something we could put in this indictment. It's related in some kind of way. And then other things happened. There was a guy named Ray Amerson, one of the later defendants. He also was caught in February of 1981 with a gun and teas and blues in a house with search warrants. He had pagers and a police scanner. All of that indicates there's a little bit more sophistication going on than your standard, street level dope dealer. The fact they had a police scanner, they're paying attention to what police are doing. They're being very careful, and it was a step above your low level drug dealer. So those things were going on. And Jerry apparently was making money at that time, but he was also concerned about competition. And one of his competitors at the time was a guy named Lydell Bud Green. Bud Green was a well-known drug dealer among the police community, and had gone way back in time. And it was seen as a competitor to Jerry Lewis, and Jerry apparently wanted to wipe out the competition. So in June of 1981, came across a hand grenade somehow, and Jerry and Sam Petty planned a way to get the hand grenade thrown into Bud Green's house. If I remember right, I think Ronnie Thomas, who also became a defendant, was the guy who threw the grenade into Bud Green's house, but the grenade didn't detonate. Later on, police got the grenade, and it wasn't a dummy grenade. It was an actual grenade. It was a live grenade, and they went somewhere to detonate it. Since that was June 3rd of 81 that happened, and since it was unsuccessful, Jerry and his group paid attention to Bud Green, and at some point somebody had seen Bud Green, who was on federal parole at the time, going into the federal courthouse or coming out of the federal courthouse while on parole, and so they followed him, and Bud drove west on Forest Park Expressway, and as he approached the intersection with North Grand or Grand Boulevard at that point, the group, Jerry and his friends or whoever was in the van, pulled up alongside Bud Green and shot at him multiple times. And if I remember right, the testimony trial was that Ronnie Thomas and Ray Amerson and Carlton Darden were involved in the shooting. Jerry was involved in the surveillance to make sure they tracked him down. And they said they shot Green multiple times, but he survived. They thought, Jerry, if I remember right, the testimony was that Jerry had driven by and actually seen Bud laying on the ground thinking he was dead, but he wasn't dead. He lived, but at some point after that, Bud wisely left St. Louis. And much, much later, we wound up talking to Bud Green during the investigation stage, and he agreed to cooperate as well.
Correct.
Bud had, by that point, a bad case of emphysema, and he couldn't complete a sentence very well, so we wound up in trial when he testified, asking him yes or no questions, basically. We got permission from the court to do that, to kind of ask leading questions. Normally, you can't ask leading questions on direct examination.
His emphysema was that bad?
Oh, it's terrible, yeah. And I could imitate it on audio, but it would just hurt your listeners' ears, probably.
Right.
But he could just go yes or no, kind of like that. And so we'd ask him questions based on the long debriefing we had of him, and he would either confirm or give a negative on various things, and his testimony came in. And again, it was helpful in that regard, too.
And then tell us a little bit about what they did after Bud Green left.
Well, then, again, by looking through police reports and collecting any time these people that we thought were associated with Jerry Lewis had been arrested, we found all these kind of common links, addresses, phone numbers, things like that. And so there were multiple times where, for example, later after the Bud Green shooting, Carlton Darden was caught with a gun. Later on, Ronnie Thomas and Garland Rush were caught with teas and blues and guns. Noble Bennett was caught with $4,200 cash, some marijuana, some cut agent mannitol that's often used with cocaine or heroin. He had a police scanner and a bulletproof vest. at a place he resided at or used on West Pine. So multiple things happened along that time. And later on, we found out that Earl Parnell wound up meeting Jerry Lewis back in 1982 through his work with Noble Bennett. And over time, Earl and Jerry would talk, and Earl would wind up supplying guns to the Jerry Lewis organization from times. Much later, we found out about some of those incidents. But again, looking through all these police reports, you'd find incidents where Ray Emerson would get caught with T's and blues or and a gun and some cash by the family market. Ray and Jerry and Michael Williams were at the family market one time where Ray got caught with T's and blues and cash. Jerry had a gun at that time back in '82. There's a gun in T's and Blues at Jerry Lewis's Stone Ridge house where an excellent detective named Tom Murphy was involved in a search warrant in that incident. And Jerry wasn't home at the time, however, so the kid didn't develop into a prosecution. But again, all these incidents happened, and Carlton was found with
Connecting
a gun.
the dots, right?
Yeah, connecting the dots. One
Right.
time Carlton was driving or had taken a Mercedes in for some repair work, and while there, somebody noticed, one of the repairmen, I'm assuming, somebody noticed that there was a spot to hide things in the car, and a gun was hidden in it. So the police were notified. They pulled Carlton Darden over in the Mercedes and found the gun hidden there back in December of 1982. And later on, they found Jerry was using that same car that had this hidden hiding spot in it. And still later on, they found out that Noble Bennett's brother, Andrew Bennett, had a auto kind of body shop or some kind of auto repair facility in North St. Louis, and he would allegedly put these hiding spots in cars. He'd build the spots in cars, and so they were all linked in some kind of way. And it just took time to go over all these reports and piece these little bits and pieces together.
And I think one of the things too is that as you're doing a historical and as you're getting these cooperators, the cooperators are pretty much, through all of them, pretty much nail down what you guys were thinking through the historical, correct?
Correct. And again, I've only gone up to 82 or 83 or so, and we still didn't have cooperators at that point. And,
Right.
And again, it's around 83 or so that initial investigation as the no stuff matter got started. We had no cooperators. We had nobody flipping. Nobody was making undercover buys, things like that. And so various things were still happening in the group, as we found out later by pulling all these police reports. They were still active, and one time, for example, police in '83 pulled over Doris Lewis, Jerry's wife at the time, and she had gun permits in the car that indicated she'd purchased a bunch of different guns, and they found out later on 4 other women were purchasing guns for the group and things like that. But again, we didn't know it at the time, but those are things that people, police would find this evidence, and nobody was sitting down to put it all together. In early 1984, Noble Bennett was paroled on a different conviction he had, and got paroled to a halfway house, and he kind of picked up right where he had left off, was selling heroin again. Earl Parnell was working with him at that time, and other people were selling heroin for him, and they would hang out at his brother Andrew's auto care shop on the north side. And eventually, another thing that happened that kind of drew attention to the group was in January of 1985, there was a guy named Robert Young. They called him Little Rob. Robert Young had murdered Jerry Lewis's brother a long time prior, and he had a fairly lengthy sentence, but he'd done his lengthy sentence and was released to a halfway house, which at the time was called the St. Mary's Honor Center on the near south side. It was just off of Shodo.
Right across from the Peabodys.
Yeah.
Right across Shodo from the Peabodys.
Yeah, from the projects there. And so he was living there, and at the same time, Ronnie Thomas was housed in that same St. Mary's Honor Center. Jerry and his group knew about this. They knew that Rob had been convicted of the murder, and Jerry had kind of sworn an oath of vengeance against little Rob. So Jerry and Gerald Hopkins and Michael Williams, all of whom were people working with Jerry, wound up contacting Thomas, who agreed to kill Robert Young, and they ran if I remember right, they ran like a rope, or somehow they lowered something out of a window and affixed a gun to it, and so they pulled the gun up into the St. Mary's Honor Center, and Ronnie Thomas killed Robert Young as he slept. Later on, Jerry Lewis would take credit for that killing and claim that he did it personally, which was false. But that was one of the things the Jerry Lewis organization would do. They'd put out false information, disinformation, to see if it came back. They would see, oh, who's a snitch? Who's give this information to the police? So they'd put out false information on purpose, trying to find out who was snitching or providing information to police in those situations. So Jerry didn't do the killing, but he claimed that he'd done that. And also around that same time, Jerry knew about Earl Parnell working with Noble Bennett. Earl was a radio personality at the time. I can't remember what station he's on, but because of Earl being a radio personality in African American oriented programming, Earl had contact sometimes with entertainers, and Jerry thought, well, Earl, because he has contact with entertainers, he knows people who have money and they supposedly use drugs. So he talked to Earl and said, Earl, I can supply cocaine to you so you can sell it to your entertainer friends. And so they established a relationship where Earl started to get cocaine from Jerry Lewis at that time to resell, supposedly. And Earl would do various favors and knew how to get weapons sometimes. He would contact people he knew to get weapons and supply them to the Jerry Lewis people for various things they were doing. Around that same time, Jerry had made connections in politics. He was kind of using this Moorish Science Temple front as kind of indicating that he's an advocate for good. He was a religious guy. He was trying to help his community, and he got a Community Development Association contract to get tax money to support his efforts to set up some kind of a child care facility or a daycare facility, and wound up renting space at 3600 North Grand, as I recall, in a building that a deputy sheriff named Antar Tiari owned. And they set up some kind of like a daycare or some kind of facility. The temple used this facility on 3600 North Grand. As time went by and the Robert Young killing happened, I guess the city got concerned that this Moorish Science Temple group maybe is bringing bad publicity to the politicians and all that kind of stuff. They terminated the contract for CDA money, and Jerry couldn't or wouldn't continue to pay the rent on that facility. And eventually, although the one-year lease had expired, Antar Tiari moved to have them evicted. And as it got closer to eviction time, Jerry and Noble Bennett and Gerald Hopkins and Earl Parnell discussed this Tiari problem they saw as a problem, and Earl wound up supplying a gun. Then Gerald Hopkins and Jerry went to North Grand, and Gerald Hopkins killed this Tiari guy while Jerry was kind of the getaway driver. Jerry had this, as I mentioned, kind of a phony alibi, not kind of, it was a phony alibi, claiming he was in D.C. at the time, trying to distance himself from that. There was another
So that's
guy,
the one he tried to that you mentioned earlier that he tried to distance himself from.
Yeah,
Okay.
they had fake hotel registration as if he had been in there, but he wasn't there. There was another guy who was a non-indicted co-conspirator that we wound up not prosecuting nor using as a witness, a guy named Randy Bay, Vincent Randall Thornton. He was doing time in federal prison in Milan, Michigan. He was on the street at this time. Later on, got his parole revoked, if I remember right, but somehow or another wound up being in prison. We went and talked to him later on, and he didn't want to cooperate anymore, and he wound up doing a long period of time as a prisoner as well. Again, during this period in '85, Earl was getting cocaine from Ray Amerson, from Gerald Hopkins, sometimes from Carla Seals, who was involved, sometimes from a guy named Gary Hamill. Gary Hamill, I wound up prosecuting in a separate prosecution based on a kind of for lack of a better term, a smaller case where he got arrested.
So he was familiar to you.
Yeah, so I knew about him too. So things, again, this is all in the mid-'80s. Again, I'm not involved in the case at that point or the investigation.
But this is just keep going, because this is a good timeline of exactly how things were going.
Well, they were continuing doing what they were doing. And for example, June of '86, Jerry got stopped with a large amount of cash during a traffic violation. October of '86, he got a traffic ticket and at a parking violation, and he had over $2,000 cash with him at that time. His license plate was linked on that car to a car that was used in the Antar Tiari murder, although they didn't know it at the time. Later on, we figured that out, that car's plate was the same on the car that was used in the Tiari murder. Later on, during '86, Earl Parnell, who eventually became a cooperator, would testify that he had seen Jerry and Ray Emerson with bricks of cocaine, large amounts of cocaine, and time went by. Again, by the time it was kind of mid or May of 1987, an incident happened where a postman was murdered who had been a customer of a guy named Ricky Durham. He'd been a drug customer, cocaine customer of a guy named Ricky Durham. And so Jerry Lewis had been supplying Durham with his product that he had been selling to the postman. a witness to that murder was a guy named Mark Anderson. And the night before he was supposed to testify in the murder case against the person who killed the postman, Mark Anderson was murdered. Much later on, again, it was to stem the federal prosecution in that case. A guy named Robert Taylor Bay, who later on himself was killed up in Chicago. But at the time, he was the guy who committed the murder of Mark Anderson, and he was associated with Jerry Lewis as well. And that association was again proven through a lot of different paperwork that was eventually recovered in some of the search warrants.
So that in that particular one, the postman got killed, or
Yeah.
But the postman gets killed, but then the witness to the thing gets killed too.
Exactly. Yeah. The
And
night before he was supposed to testify.
And the Jerry Lewis group was responsible for killing of the witness.
Correct, because
Gotcha.
the witness was going to testify against one of their own.
Gotcha.
This Ricky Durham guy, if I remember right. And anyway, and Jerry had identified who the witness was from discovery papers that had been turned over by the prosecution in that case, and that's how they knew that they were going to target Mark Anderson. So that happened during that time period. In June, shortly after the postman's murder, there's an incident where Gerald Hopkins and Carla Seals, who were kind of an item at one time, were in a big argument in a car, and some police officers saw the big argument and were trying to calm things down, and one thing led to another, and they found cocaine and money in a pouch in the car. And these are little bits of seizures and things along the time, but all those things later on, when we found those reports, we were able to put it together and link things, and that helped us when we finally did get some cooperators to talk about these incidents. We could ask about what happened. You know anything about that? And they said, oh yeah, we knew it happened. Here's what the story was behind the story. And so we get information. During this period in the summer of 1987, I mentioned before that Jerry was very aggravated at Bud Green, and Bud Green had people who were family members or associates of his in his drug dealing, and they had actually, after Bud left the area, they were dealing as well. And so Jerry, one of the people that was aligned with Bud Green was a guy named Bruce Hat Henry. Hat was a nickname. And so Jerry had Bruce Hat Henry killed at 1250 Showdown, and there was I think a bunch of indications that happened by Ray Emerson with a gun that Earl delivered to Jerry, Ray, and Gerald Hopkins at the actual Moorish Science Temple building on West Florissant at that time. About a month later, a little less than a month actually, another guy who was aligned with Bud Green, it was Bud's nephew actually, a guy named Harold Count Johnson, was on the street. He got killed at 1159 Hamilton on Jerry's instance by Ray Emerson and Gerald Hopkins. They were all wearing fatigues. That kind of became kind of a signature mark for them. They'd put on army fatigues and go out hunting for people they wanted to kill. And then a few days later, there's another guy who's aligned with Count Johnson named David Grady. His street name was Kiki. So they killed Kiki Grady on August 23rd of 1987, very near 5754 West Florissant, which is where the Temple building was. And again, that murder eventually was done by Ray Emerson and or Gary Hamill, apparently. So all these various murders
and
were happening.
these last three murders that you mentioned were all related to Bud Green, who had skipped town before these murders happened. So these guys, so then later, obviously, probably why Bud Green decided to cooperate is because he,
Yeah, that was one of the things, is that his people and maybe family members were being kind of rubbed out. Another thing about the Harold Count Johnson thing, Harold had previously been involved in the Moorish Science Temple in prison. There are what we call prison Moors and street Moors. And the Moorish Science Temple organization oftentimes provides some kind of membership or affiliation to people who are in prison, and the Missouri prison system was pretty heavily involved with people involved in the Moorish Science Temple. So while Count Johnson was in the Missouri prison system, he got interested in the movement and decided to kind of have his own temple. They would call their temples like a affiliated temple number 1 or local temple number 51 or 52 or things like that. And so Count Johnson had his own group of the Moorish Science Temple. So he's not only seen as a competitor on the drug scene, once he got out, he was also seen as a competitor to Jerry's involvement in the Moorish Science Temple in St. Louis. So both of those reasons likely could have been the motive for the murder. But and his alignment with Bud Green was clearly a problem.
So then you left off in about at the end of '87 here, August of '87, and then in '88, another rival dope man appears.
Exactly. There's a guy named Billy Patton who was apparently a fairly active drug dealer on the north side, and Jerry regarded him as competition as well. And they would go out on hunting trips, basically trying to look for Billy Patton. And in March 8th, I think, of '88, Ray Emerson, Gerald Hopkins, Gary Hamill were found by police with guns in a car. They were all wearing fatigues except for one who was wearing all black. And they were out there looking for Billy Patton. The police didn't know it at the time, but they knew something was up at a traffic stop. And
did they arrest them at that time?
The short answer is I don't recall. They might have arrested him for the guns, but I don't think there was a case that was issued on it. And so they just knew it happening. There was a police report that indicated that it happened, which we found out much later. Not too much later than that, in the spring of '88, some people who were aligned with Billy Patton and his organization wind up getting murdered by Jerry Lewis's people. There's a guy named Brian Hall who was a paraplegic and was murdered in the Walnut Park area, if I remember right, of North St. Louis. He had sold cocaine for Billy, and when he was killed, he was found in a car all shot up with $44,000. So it's clearly not a robbery. They just wanted to rub him out. And later on, it was found out that Ray Emerson, Gerald Hopkins, and Robert Taylor were apparently involved in doing the hunt anyway for Bryant Hall, and Jerry was involved in the hunt as well. Another guy who gets murdered who was aligned with Billy Patton happened on March 29th of '88, a guy named Jeffrey White. He was killed. And then one of Billy Patton's sisters named Andrea Patton, she was driving in North County one time and knew where Billy was hiding out kind of up there. And as she drove away, was coming south on 367, and a car pulled up and shot up her car. Luckily, she wasn't hit at all, but the car had numerous bullet holes in it, and she was just a lucky person. Later on, she wound up testifying about that, and she recognized some of the people involved in that shooting as being involved with Jerry's group. Still later, I believe it's March 27th of that year, Kevin Patton, known as Fluky Patton, was shot at as well by, I think, Ray Emerson and Gerald Hopkins were involved in that. Shortly after they shot and missed him, Jerry called Billy Patton's mother, she had a different last name, Mrs. Hunt, I think was her last name, and said, "Did I get the motherfucker," to use his language, and she said no and chastised him for being involved in all this kind of violence, and he didn't have much more to say. I guess after that, I don't recall.
Did she testify?
The short answer is I don't recall if she did or not, but I know that
that's wild.
Yeah, I think she might have testified. It's been a long time. We're talking about something that's over 30 years old.
Right.
She might have testified. I just don't recall at this point. But anyway, Billy Patton by this point realized with his people being killed, it was not safe. So he left and went to California for a while, and eventually felt it was safe enough to come back. And when he did come back, he got killed in January of 1989. We can talk more about that in a little
Wrong.
bit. But he made a wrong move on that, I suppose. But then, and again, other things were happening. Again, we didn't link it all at this time, but through getting all the reports later on, we figured out things were happening. In April and May of 1989, the Noble Bennett investigation had heated up, and that's when the California source had dried up. Prior to that time, still in '88, there's an incident where Gerald Hopkins fled from police and tossed some cocaine, was found with a pager. He'd been arrested in Chicago just prior to that with some marijuana and over $1,000 cash in April. An interesting thing happened in May. Some TV news show occurred, and they showed Ray Emerson, Gary Hamill, and a guy named Walton Bay on camera, kind of marching, kind of a protest, I suppose, about what they contended were over-aggressive police tactics. They were wearing fatigues and using walkie-talkies, and it was shown on the TV news. They weren't interviewed, but it was just shown on there. But at that same time, we knew that they were using walkie-talkies to surveil and track down murder victims and things like that, and they often wore fatigues. So there was video evidence on television of them doing what we knew they were doing, or
wearing the clothing that you were
and
familiar with?
that was shown in the trial itself. Eventually, some of those news clips were shown. Ronnie Thomas in that summer of 89, or 88, I should say, was caught with an AK-47, some other guns, ammunition, a scale, and marijuana, and he had Jerry falsely testified at his trial on those charges as well. And again, he eventually got convicted of being a felon in possession, he being Ronnie, and did some time on that. But again, Jerry tried to get him off the hook, so to speak, and they would help each other in these ways. And all this time as well, which came out in the federal trial and came out when the search warrants were done, when the indictment came down, they were acquiring a lot of evidence, and they, being the Jerry Lewis organization, was acquiring a lot of police reports, DEA 6s even, the reports basically the DEA people write. They had intelligence detectives' memoranda about the Moorish Science Temple activities, things like that, mug shots, all kinds of kind of counterintelligence kind of information where they were monitoring what the police were doing. They kept tabs on it and to find out who they could trust, who they couldn't trust, who were informants, who were likely to be informants, all kinds of things like that. Where they got that information to this day isn't really known, but they had some kind of police.
They had information that definitely came from the other side of the fence.
Definitely, yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
But you guys could never
No,
figure that
we
out.
I wouldn't want to say on
Right. You have
Mike
your, you have your
who
hunches.
we thought was
but-
involved.
right.
Yeah,
Right.
there was some kind of leakage of information apparently. So anyway, all this stuff is going on. Ray Emerson's caught with a gun that summer also by the family market. Gary Hamill and a guy named Douglas Williams were in a cocaine deal in North County. In October of '88, that's an incident that I mentioned. I prosecuted that case, if I remember right. I think I was the prosecutor in that case. And Michael Lewis and Randy Bay were kind of nearby observing the deal when a police officer from the county came across this drug deal happening. And so Hamill and Douglas Williams got prosecuted and convicted about that. But again, they didn't want to cooperate in any kind of way, but they were convicted, and they were dealing cocaine at that time. Like I said, Michael and Randy Bay were kind of observing from afar as lookouts. During the summer and autumn of '88, Noble and Jerry Lewis were growing closer. Like I said, Noble's heroin source had dried up, and so Noble wanted to make money, and so they had been doing some heroin deals with George Noel. And around that same time, there was a customer that they had who was dealing for them named Wilbert Blake, and he died down in the city in where he lived, and police were called to the scene where he died, and whether it was an overdose or a hot shot or whatever it was, but he died. And when they went to the house and kind of cleaned out the house, they found a bunch of papers that linked him to Jerry Lewis as well. Again, all these little bits and pieces were being picked up over the years, and so later on, as the Noble Bennett case investigation was coming to a conclusion, I believe it was October 12th of '88, they did a bunch of search warrants in that case. One of the things they found doing the search warrants at Noble Bennett's sister's house was a photocopy of Detective Sergeant Sal Sierra's credentials that had been obtained at a financial institution where a subpoena had been served, and Sal had allowed them to take a photocopy of his credentials as part to show that he's legitimate and serving the subpoena appropriately. Somehow or another, that photocopy came from that financial institution to Noble Bennett, and it was hidden in a toilet tank cover in Noble Bennett's house at that time.
Just more signs of counterintelligence.
Gathering information, and again, the case was going on. And after those search warrants happened then in October of '88, it was November of '88 that Earl Parnell decided to cooperate and talk to the various Sal Sierra and other and Don Mandrell, et cetera. And he agreed actually to do something that was frankly very brave on his part, wear a wire or wear a hidden recorder when he had conversations with these various people that were involved, and he began cooperating, and for almost 6 months did that. The recordings oftentimes weren't particularly legible or audible, but some of them were, and some of them were very telling. And of course, he was a kind of unique person in the sense that he had a terrific memory, and you could tell when he would start remembering things, it was almost like a movie was playing in his head, and he could tell you, here's what happened next and next and next. And you could cross-examine him and do all kinds of testing to make sure he wasn't making it up. And he wasn't. He knew things, and he had a really terrific memory, and like I said, was very brave and for about 6 months' time doing this, but he eventually wound up getting put in the witness security program.
So at this point is when you're starting to combine those two cases, the Noble Bennett case and the Jerry Lewis organization, two organizations.
Well, again, I'm not doing it because I'm still not involved in the case at this point.
Right.
But the investigators who were involved in the Noble Bennett thing realized from Earl Parnell and George Noel coming forward that there's a real link here, and maybe we can make a case against Jerry Lewis. So around that same time, the fact that the Jerry Lewis investigation hadn't gone anywhere for several years and had actually been shut down, as I recall, eventually the U.S. attorney came to me and said, hey, do you want to take this thing over? They've developed some witnesses and there might be something there. And I said, well, sure, I know something about this because way back in the early 1980s, that information I had with John Green and some reading I'd done about the group at that time was of interest. And I thought,
so these are the puzzle pieces that you guys are just plugging in. And what we're going through here is the timeline of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I kind of get involved. I don't think I was involved in 88. I think it started in sometime in 89. But in 88, there were still other things going on. The group was still doing murders. And for example, there was a guy named Ronnie Anderson who was killed by Ronnie Thomas at Jerry Lewis's request, basically, at a kind of an infamous shooting at a place called the My Way Lounge on West Florissant in North City. West Florissant or North Florissant? I think it was West Florissant. And Jerry and Ray Emerson had helped hunt for Ronnie Anderson, and they figured out through various girlfriends, et cetera, that Ronnie was at this place. Ronnie Anderson was at the place, the eventual victim, and he had been an associate of Billy Patton and Bryant Hall. And much later, once Ronnie Thomas cooperated, he told us about how he, for example, once he was advised that, oh yeah, Ronnie's at this place, the eventual victim, he went and hid underneath a parked car in a parking lot across from the My Way Lounge. And when Ronnie Anderson came out, Ronnie Thomas came out from under the car and killed Ronnie Anderson and then escaped. He used a gun that Carla Seals had supplied from storage in that murder, again, knowing that the murder was going to happen at Jerry's behest, basically. So around that same time also, we were looking into the fact that we knew Jerry Lewis from his phone calls had been in contact with a federal prisoner, Sam Petty. And so we looked into the fact that Sam Petty in federal prison had his phone calls recorded, and we found a number of phone calls between Lewis and Petty that were recorded, and they talked about in kind of code. They weren't blatant about what they talked about, but they talked about the killing of the guy at the My Way Lounge, and Sam basically sought for Jerry to arrange a killing that Sam wanted to have done of someone. Sam Petty basically had, worked as more or less an advisor, kind of a consigliere to Jerry Lewis and this thing. So we had enough evidence from those various calls and eventually from cooperators as well that we knew Sam Petty would make an appearance on our indictment as a defendant as well. Things moved on from December of 88 into January of 89. Earl Parnell was recording conversations with Jerry and with a guy named Willie Mack Dixon, with Noble Bennett. The many times they talked about different murders, different guns that they require or wanted. They talk about drugs from time to time. But again, because Earl was being extremely careful, as anybody who's dealt with such murderous people should be, he would keep a hidden recorder down in a boot that he was wearing, and the boot was often underneath a table. They'd meet in a restaurant or a bar or something, and so the sound quality was very poor in most of these calls. But there were sections that were good enough to hear, and sometimes it wouldn't be in a bar. It might be in a restaurant or things, and sometimes the quality of the recordings was decent. So we got a lot of recordings over that time period. Earl continued to make those recordings up through about April of 89 when he went into the witness security program as well. During that time period, other things would happen of interest. In January of 89, the Moorish Science Temple group headed by Jerry Lewis as Grand Sheik would hold a banquet where they tried to have looked like they were a legitimate organization and being helpful in some kind. So at Stouffer's Concourse Hotel up near the airport, they would have a banquet, and at one point during that time, Ray Emerson said that an AUSA, Assistant Prosecuting Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney Deborah Herzog, who was involved with the Noble Bennett case, that she needed to be hit or killed, in other words. So people were concerned, obviously, at this point that these guys are getting, even more violent. Like I mentioned before, Billy Patton returned during January of '89, and he was seen in a hospital lobby, I think Barnes Hospital lobby, by a person associated with Jerry, a guy named Tyrone Burrell. Burrell apparently told Jerry, and that's how he knew Billy Patton was back. And so Billy Patton was killed at an apartment, and kind of an interesting murder, the way it came out during the trial. A guy named Willie Mitchell had this apartment, and he and Billy Patton and several others were in the apartment rocking up cocaine or doing something drug-related.
Something illegal.
Yeah, something illegal. And from time to time, somebody would knock on a door and maybe make a sale or whatever. But at one point, and they had weapons with them in the apartment. At one point, one of the guys who was there with a weapon ostensibly to protect Billy Patton and the people involved in those drug deals answered a soft knock at the door, but he stepped outside and in kind of a setup situation, which allowed then Ray Amerson to come in, and Ray then killed Billy Patton, shooting him multiple times on a couch there in the apartment. I mentioned there was a guy named Willie Mitchell. Willie Mitchell, when he realized what was going on, he ran to the bathroom, got on the floor of the bathroom, braced his back against the sink commode kind of, and pushed his foot against the door, thinking the guy's going to come in and kill me. And in fact, Ray Emerson did shoot through the door multiple times, both high and low, but luckily the bullets missed Willie Mitchell. Willie Mitchell, later on after we got information about that incident, we located Willie Mitchell, who was at a mental institution at the time, being treated, but he remembered the incident very well, could recount it, and we actually had him testify at the trial as well. So we pulled him from a mental institution to come testify, and after he testified, he went back to the mental institution.
So, just to interrupt, is that an issue in trial? Does the defense?
We turned that information over to the defense that this guy had mental problems, and of course they tried to cross-examine about that, but he did a good job in the trial, and nothing was hidden from the jury, and it all worked out pretty well. So that happened. In February of '89, there were more tapes made by Earl Parnell with Noble and Jerry and Dixon. In March, there were some more Sam Petty, Jerry Lewis-Bey phone calls from prison where murders were discussed, cocaine was discussed, prices were discussed, a hit on witnesses, the fact that they had Sal Sierra's picture was discussed, if I remember right, in some of the conversations. And so, again, all these things were happening along that time period, and I'm not sure that I was involved yet in that case, but right around that time is when the case got assigned to me, and I first met with Earl Parnell.
So now we're in about the 91-ish?
It's 89.
Okay.
Actually, I wasn't involved yet because I wasn't involved and didn't meet with Earl Parnell until after he was in the Witness Security Program, which was in April.
Okay.
So these things are going on still.
So Sal and Donnie and Bobby Dwyer are just kind of working this thing together and just keeping the facts all together.
And we haven't started pulling all those reports and piecing things together to look at all these little bits and pieces to kind of weave what was out there together.
So like Larry Plyman and Mike Duker, and nobody's involved yet. It's just Sal.
Those two were, I don't remember that they're involved in the Bennett case or not, actually. I don't think they were. But, and I also, I don't know if I mentioned, Frank Banaszak also got involved.
Right.
And Frank was a very important investigator as well.
But they're not quite involved yet. I think that's right. It's 89.
89.
Harry Hager sends Frank Banaszak and Bob Dwyer down there in 1989.
Okay.
Does that sound right?
That's probably right.
Okay.
Again, it's been a long time, but it's somewhere around there. And the Noble Bennett indictment with Dixon and Noel and 32 others being indicted happened in mid-April of '89. And during that time, and later on, we found out that Jerry was planning to kill Earl's brothers as a way to kind of shut up Earl, hopefully intimidate him. And we knew that because George Noel had discussed that, or had heard that being discussed by Noble while they sat in the holdover in the federal courthouse as a response to them all being indicted. And that's kind of one of the things that led George Noel to come to the police and say, hey, I want to cooperate now. They're going too far. And so there were more calls between Petty and Jerry Lewis, things we found out. And again, I mentioned the fact that they had a banquet in January of '89. They also had a banquet in January of 1990. And again, now that I think about it, I know that I still wasn't involved in the case yet, because in that instance, the Moorish Science Temple banquet in January of 1990 was occurring, and the authorities had gotten a court-authorized wiretap of Jerry Lewis's hotel room for that. And through the wiretap, they got information, overheard information about Jerry Lewis and Rudy Weaver talking about cocaine and counting money at the hotel room, decrying, complaining about informants. At one point, Jerry was arguing with his wife, Tanya, about his girlfriend, Carla. Things like that were happening. They overheard all these various things. And the booklet that they published or printed for the attendees of the banquet was dedicated to 6 people who at that time were in prison: Gary Hamill, Ray Emerson, Randy Bay, Gerald Hopkins, Ronnie Thomas, and Sam Petty, all of whom were people involved in the Jerry Lewis organization. But they published in their booklet and dedicated their booklet to these people, which helped to show this association, in fact, in a racketeering enterprise that later on they were all charged with. In the meantime, Jerry's ex-wife, or estranged wife, Doris Lewis, over various periods when she would be mad at Jerry during the 1980s, would sometimes come to police and inform on or give information about Jerry's activities. But then later on, around this time period, in early 1990, I believe it was, or late 80s, Bob Dwyer and Larry O'Toole made arrangements to meet with her, and they met with her on if I remember right, on a Shell station lot in near Normandy in North County, and thinking that she was going to give more information. Instead, she played dumb, said she never said those things, or if she did, she was high or wrong, and was obviously not being helpful at all anymore. And later on, in that same day, officers found that Jerry had met with Doris, and she had been wearing a microcassette recorder to make a recording to use in a defense, because Jerry, I guess, could feel that police were maybe looking at him, and he was trying to develop a defense with false evidence. As time went on, I mentioned earlier, I think, that a guy named Kerry Caldwell, he got arrested on Thanksgiving in 1990 with an Uzi. Doing a search on the Uzi, found out that Tanya Brown had purchased that Uzi in 1984 and reported it stolen in 1986. And then talking to Kerry, he wanted to cooperate right away. He revealed a lot. He revealed his relationship with Michael Shepard Bay and cocaine dealings with him and with Jerry and with Michael Lewis and Michael Williams, with Rudy Weaver. He knew about Johnny, the source of supply. Jerry had offered $50,000 to kill a prosecutor at that point. He knew that information as well. And he also knew about the fact that a guy named Michael Williams, who was involved with Jerry, had killed a guy named Fred Knox during the course of the investigation because of what Earl had told us about where guns were coming from that he would supply to Jerry. We knew that Fred Knox was arranging to get firearms through a relative that Fred had down in Mississippi. And so we wanted to subpoena Fred Knox to get him in front of the grand jury and question him about that. When he got the subpoena, apparently people realized he got the federal subpoena, and Jerry felt that he couldn't risk Fred Knox coming to the grand jury, so he had Michael Williams kill Fred Knox. Kerry Caldwell, like I mentioned, recorded some phone calls with Michael Shepard that later on helped Shepard decide to come and cooperate as well in post-indictment. Eventually, all this information, these little bits and pieces and incidents over the years, plus the people who cooperated by that point, led us to think we've got enough evidence at this point. Let's indict these people, do some search warrants. We'll find additional evidence, hopefully, and see what happens. So on January 9th of 1991, 15 defendants were indicted. A bunch of search warrants were executed at that time. They found many guns and scales with cocaine residue, a lot of photographs and drug notations, furs and jewelry, over $50,000 cash at Jerry's sister's house. There's the scrapbook I mentioned, full of intelligence and police reports and mugshots and background information, things that the St. Louis Intelligence Division had put together, things like that, that they had somehow accessed over the years and saved over the years. Rudy Weaver, like I mentioned, became a cooperator and gave a detailed history of what they're involved with, made the phone call to Johnny to bring some cocaine up, which he did. Johnny, Juan Alfaro Gonzalez, delivered 4 kilos, got caught, cooperated. He had a lot of information, basically had delivered over 200 kilos of cocaine over a time period to Jerry's group, to Jerry primarily. That's who he dealt with and called the Cisco.
And where was Juan out of?
He was out of Miami.
Miami, okay.
And he got his cocaine directly from Colombian drug traffickers.
I think there's probably about 10 Juan Gonzalez's that are in jail for.
Yeah, yeah. Juan Alfaro Gonzalez was his name. Went by Johnny, and had a nickname of the German because he somehow had some.
Now,
background.
did he have ties to St. Louis? Other than the Lewis, or
no,
other than the Lewis-Bey?
And the short answer is I don't recall. I probably knew at one time, but I don't recall how Jerry got hooked up with Johnny, but he did. And it didn't have any particular ties to St. Louis that I knew of, but he made repeated trips to St. Louis,
Okay,
bringing
I
up.
was just going to say, was he the guy that delivered?
Yeah, he.
So he was the guy that delivered.
He wasn't the main organizer from Miami or like that, but he was a delivery man.
Right. Okay.
Made multiple trips. Interesting about Juan, he got indicted. Eventually pled guilty, like I said, in the southern district of Illinois. But while he was housed in a holding facility in Greenville, Illinois, he escaped, and later on, he got recaptured and told us how he escaped through a ceiling vent of some kind and hid in the above a semi truck in the kind of the air deflection thing that you see on a lot of semi trucks. He hid up in there. He's a kind of a small person. He's hid up in there. When the truck drove away, he got away. Eventually returned to Florida. The Marshal Service tracked him down and eventually arrested him and brought him back in. And he, again, by this point, wasn't going to be allowed to escape, and he wound up testifying in the trials of cooperator as well. I mentioned Michael Shepard came to us. He also had done time with Jerry Lewis's pal Walton in the Moorish Science Temple. Had done a long sentence, and Jerry would visit him in prison. He knew of Jerry's admissions to various attacks on Bud Green and DeCount and Billy Patton and the plot versus Lorenzo Petty that was in existence at the time, things like that. And was involved with Johnny and Jerry's cocaine dealing from about November 90 on. Not a long period of time, but he definitely was involved. Another cooperator came along. I can't remember how we found him, but a guy named Jesse Smith cooperated. He had gotten somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 kilos of coke from Jerry over the time period of about a 6 to 8 month time period, and traded 2 AK-47s for cocaine at one time. And later on, after the trade, Ronnie Thomas was found with that particular K-47. So a lot of things we could piece together from all these reports and these cooperators. Things made sense, and you could put it all together. And eventually then, Ronnie Thomas came to us and decided to cooperate as well. Ronnie was Jerry's cousin. Obviously, they went way back. He detailed many, many murders that he'd been involved in at Jerry's behest. He also detailed a number of murders that he did on his own, basically, about 10 different ones. And so eventually, when he was testifying, we brought all that out. Not only the murders he'd done at Jerry's behest, we also brought out, so the jury could hear the whole story about Ronnie Thomas, about the 10 or so murders he had committed. And when he was cross-examined, the defense apparently knew about 2 other murders that he hadn't mentioned, and they cross-examined about that. And he admitted, oh yeah, I forgot about those.
Forgot about them, huh?
He had forgotten about them, and so, but again, he actually
not a good, not a good dude. And then
Earl Parnell used to talk about Ronnie Thomas and say, Ronnie Thomas killed more people than cancer, is what Earl would say, because he would kill a lot of people. And but he did it basically most of the time at Jerry's behest, and was an important hitman for Jerry and also a drug dealer. As time went on, Michael Lewis, Jerry's brother, also decided to cooperate, and through his lawyer came to us. We wound up interviewing him as well. You talked about the fact that he, in the early days of the early 80s, was also a teas and blues dealer. Not a big dealer, but worked with product he got from Jerry. He knew of various murders in the membership. He knew of Johnny, the supply. He knew about the Detroit trip that they took as a alibi for the Fred Knox murders. And he said that the Fred Knox murder wasn't done by the person I named earlier, but that it was actually done by Jerry's son, Little Mark Lewis. I don't know if that's true or not, but he said that Little Mark committed that murder and that Michael Williams' role was to dispose of the gun that Little Mark used. I think Michael Williams was possibly the shooter, but I don't know that for sure either way anymore. It's been a long time. He also talked to us about the $400,000 in the store attic that was missed by the police, and that the wives eventually got that money and it was used for the defense lawyers, et cetera. So, and then the trial started in October of '92, and it took 5 months, basically 4 days a week trial to put on the prosecution's case. All these various cooperators, all these various police officers had to testify, and they did a very good job withstanding cross-examination. There were 9 defendants in the courtroom. The courtroom had 2 long rows of tables that all these defendants and their lawyers were seated at, and each of the 9 lawyers for these 9 defendants had a chance to cross-examine all these various witnesses, which made the trial go on and on and on for a long time. And some of the witnesses were on for days at a time. Some of the witnesses who maybe just had a short thing to say, nonetheless, wound up being cross-examined by 9 different defense lawyers, so it took longer than you'd hope for. And the whole thing, like I said, took about 5 months. The prosecution's case rested in mid-March of '93. The defense then began a case that lasted about 2 months, maybe a little bit more than 2 months. And we had closing arguments, and the jury got the case, and it took, between the time the jury got the case and the time they returned guilty verdicts, was 11 days. Now, there were 2 different sets of weekends in the middle of that, so they weren't in deliberations for that long. But for 11 days, we weren't 100% sure how the jury verdict was going to come out. And when the verdict was finally returned, 7 of the defendants were convicted. All 7 of those defendants were convicted of counts 1 and 2, which was the RICO and the RICO conspiracy charges. And Jerry and Ray Emerson were convicted of several counts of the committing violent acts and aid of racketeering counts as well. And so all those people got convicted. Sam Petty and Mac Tompkins were acquitted, which we knew Sam, the case was not a lot stronger than him. We kind of was a little surprised that Mac Tompkins was acquitted. Not that he was highly involved, but he's involved enough where he should have been convicted, I thought. But the interesting thing about his case was after he was acquitted and released, within, I think, roughly 4 to 6 weeks, he was out apparently dealing in or trying to acquire heroin and was murdered on the streets of St. Louis. So his being acquitted didn't help him in the long run.
That doesn't help. But one of the things that you mentioned to me is, and we talked about it earlier, that Ronnie Thomas, I mean, I guess you're upwards of 20 murders that he might have been involved in. But you had some consternation over. Talk about a little bit about, as a prosecutor, when you're deciding on what kind of sentences to give people, who to give breaks to, is it's not that easy, is it?
No, it's not easy at all, and because you want to do justice, and you also want to get convictions of the people who truly deserve to be convicted. And we knew Ronnie Thomas was the kind of person who scared everybody in St. Louis if they knew about him, and was willing to pretty much murder anybody who he needed to or was paid to murder. So he was not a great person. So we had to figure out what to do with him. So he wound up pleading guilty to one or more, I can't remember, one or more, I think several murders in state court and getting a life sentence in state court and pleading guilty to our racketeering charge and getting 40 years in federal court. And so that was the deal we made for Ronnie.
And the other thing that I found interesting is, obviously with a violent organization like this, there's a lot of worries about witnesses. You've mentioned a couple that went to the WITSAC program, but also you guys, the lawyers during this, yourself, Dean Hogue, and Dave, right?
Dan Newman, yeah.
You guys were all assigned U.S. Marshal security throughout the trial, correct?
Yeah, the investigators involved, Sal and the various other people, Don Mandrell, et cetera, they regarded the threats as legitimate and real. We told you about the fact there's a $50,000 contract out on the prosecutor, supposedly. And so they measured us for bulletproof vests. They brought in deputy marshals who then kind of did various things. They put a burglar alarm in our house, an emergency, panic alarm kind of things in our houses, drove us to court every day, drove us home, did 24-hour surveillance on our house during the trial. And so, yeah, they protected us. I think, I don't recall actually, I think they might have also protected the judge, although I'm not sure of that. He might have rejected it at some point, but they were doing that kind of stuff. The police officers involved, the main officers I mentioned, Sal and Don and Bob Dwyer and Frank Banaszak and Larry Plyman and Mike Duker, et cetera, they didn't have that kind of protection, being brave police officers, and maybe they didn't feel they needed it, but we just didn't know. These people were truly violent people, and they did all kinds of things during the trial with people who weren't indicted and people who were family members and associates that they were still trying to find out information about our witnesses and intimidate them. For example, when Rudy Weaver was brought in from his witness security location. They flew him into Lambert Airfield, and nobody was supposed to know when he was coming in to come to trial and testify. But as they drove from the airport down to the courthouse, some of Jerry's people, or people who at least we believe were associated with Jerry, pulled up alongside the car and were staring them down basically as they were coming into the area.
Must not have had a weapon on him.
Yeah, I guess not. So anyway,
I'm going to assume that.
but it sounds kind of hyperbolic maybe in some kind of way. But one of the things that was in the appellate brief and later on some later pleadings, and I think the Court of Appeals that affirmed the conviction of these guys had to say, was that all these people who wound up getting convicted were involved in what was phrased as an active, violent organization, racketeering enterprise of professional criminals, and then the kind of the terminology, which sounds like hyperbolic maybe, but it says an enduring, resilient criminal combination of persons associated in an extremely violent, long-term urban polydrug distribution and murder enterprise. And that's exactly what it was.
In very educated words.
Yeah. So the Court of Appeals recognized that, and lawyers who were involved in prosecuting the case recognized that. So it was an interesting case to be involved with, and I'm just glad it turned out the way it did.
One of the other things that I found interesting when we talked earlier is when Michael Lewis-Bey, the brother of Jerry, testified, and what happened in the courtroom during that.
Yeah, Michael had once he decided to cooperate, he actually was a very willing witness and told all kinds of details, did a good job, and we were pretty confident that he would be a pretty good witness. And so we kind of, when you're planning a case this long, which had, I'm not sure, I guess we had somewhere 100 witnesses or more. We had thousands of pieces of evidence, and over a 5-month period, you kind of think, well, who's going to be next? Who do you lead with? Who do you end with? And so we kind of thought, well, Michael Lewis, being Jerry's brother, would be a good closing witness because he's been reliable and given us all this information, and it's been corroborated, etc. So we kind of used him as our last witness in the case in chief. And he got on the witness stand and was doing a fine job and telling what he knew, et cetera, et cetera. But as time went on, he was both getting tired, and at some point, he was on the stand for multiple days. At some point then, near the end of his testimony, and one of the days when we were wrapping up, the peanut gallery, the audience, so to speak, had been kind of full for a lot of the incidents where people would come in and watch what's going on. And Jerry and Michael's mother was brought down. She was actually, I don't mean to chastise her, but she was morbidly obese, I guess what people would say about her if they saw her. So she very seldom left the house, but they brought her down and brought her into the courtroom, and she sat in the courtroom while Michael was wrapping up his testimony. And while he was on the witness stand, he obviously noticed that she was in the courtroom, and he kind of started hedging his testimony, not being as definitive, trying to, being a little unsure of things from time to time, and it made an impact on him. And it really was reminiscent of the scene in the movie The Godfather,
Yep.
where Michael Corleone brings over somebody's cousin or brother or somebody from Italy. It's kind of the same thing where they wanted to intimidate Michael Lewis, and it had an impact. He told most of the truth and did a good job, but it made an impact as he was trying to testify. And then on cross-examination, when they cross-examined him, he also wasn't as sure anymore of things, and he didn't do as good a job as he had in all his multiple debriefings and trial preparation sessions. But that's what you could expect from a group like this.
Is this still your most memorable trial after all those years? You went into the terrorism side, though.
Yeah, I
so
did,
that's
yeah.
probably pretty interesting.
Yeah, that was very interesting, and people always ask that, and people also say, gee, you ought to write a book about this case. And I always thought, well, that'd be interesting if I had time to do it, but I don't. And I also don't think many people would read a book about this because it's kind of standard street drug stuff that happens, and it's I'm not sure that readers.
Well, just in the last 2 months on our podcast, we've had the TT Jordan trial, same kind of thing.
Yeah.
We've talked about the BMF, the Black Mafia family, and some of them, same thing where, when you get into the game, there's an inherent risk that something might happen to you.
These guys were kind of leaders, I guess, in terms of what they were doing. All those groups that are now doing this kind of thing, and this group, the Jerry Lewis organization, was doing it first. And they were doing drive-by shootings and things like that nobody was much involved in those kind of things, and at least in organized fashion.
Counterintelligence.
Gathering counterintelligence, doing counter-surveillance, and doing purposeful disinformation, things like that. They were pretty sophisticated, and I think I mentioned to you in a interview that we had just before we started doing this recording that a lot of the people involved in this group were, for lack of a better term, kind of street dudes. They were kind of standard criminal that you see a lot of times, not terribly bright, but they get by and they commit crime, and you kind of think that that's what's going on. Jerry, on the other hand, which I didn't know much about him, and he wouldn't talk, but he testified during the trial, wasn't overly impressive during the trial, and kind of offended the jury, I think, in some ways during some of his testimony. But at the time of sentencing, when people get sentenced, the judges always have to ask the defendants who are getting sentenced. It's called allocution. So you have anything you want to say to the court before I impose sentence? And typically, defendants don't have a lot to say. Jerry, on the other hand, when he was asked to make a statement, if he wanted to make a statement, he went on for about 40 minutes. He was very articulate, seemed very bright, well-spoken. Now, maybe all of what he said was wrong. He was denying guilt, saying he was a victim, that the police treat him subhumanly, things like that. Things that just weren't right. But he made a decent presentation, right, as if he was a defense lawyer almost, and it didn't sway the court because he and the other people deserved to get life sentences, and they did. But it was, you could see why he was the leader of the organization. He clearly was a brighter person than most of the other people involved.
I want to mention that several of the people mentioned here today have passed away on our side.
Yeah.
You have Dean Hogue, complete legend in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Yep.
And we've had Frank Banaszak.
Frank Banaszak passed away. Don Mandrella passed away.
Donnie Mandrella.
Mike Letts has passed away.
Bobby Dwyer.
Dan Muhlman has passed away. Bob Dwyer. And all these people were terrific people.
Yes. And they've even named the U.S. Attorney Award after Dave, correct?
After Dan Muhlman, yes.
There's
an award that they give out.
And what was his last name again?
Muhlman, M-E-U-L-E-M-A-N, Muhlman. Turned out he was a hemophiliac from birth and had undergone a blood transfusion at some point earlier, and the blood had been, this is before they tested blood for HIV, and so he got a blood transfusion and got HIV from that. Nobody knew it at the time, and he never disclosed that to it. All the time we were doing this case, he never told us about it. He was married, and he knew that sooner or later he was going to die at an early age, and later on did die from that, and it was just a sad, sad thing. But he's the kind of guy who never asked for recognition or anything else. He just did a job, and he was a Notre Dame grad. And
and one of the other things, the last thing, is the security that was around the courthouse at the time that was provided by the St. Louis Police Department was said to be pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, and needed to be. That was one of the issues on appeal, was whether or not the defense lawyers would raise issue to the Court of Appeals saying there was too much security and it somehow affected the jury. And the court overruled those objections, of course, but there was all kinds of things. We had an anonymous jury, so nobody knew the jurors' names or where they lived. They all had numbers. Around the courthouse, the jury would meet somewhere else, and then they'd be brought in by the marshal service on buses to the courthouse so they could park somewhere else, and nobody would see what their cars were, where they were, where they came from, things like that, to keep the jury anonymity appropriate. And then they had snipers on top of the courthouse. They had two different magnetometer stations when people come into the courthouse, so to make sure nobody had any guns or any kind of weapons on them. The defense, early on, the defense lawyers had to go through magnetometers, and of course the people who were, the security people who were manning the magnetometers would look through briefcases and things that various people coming in and out of the courthouse had, and the defense lawyers objected, saying, "Oh, you're making us visible to the jury, having these people, security people, look through our paperwork. It looks like we're criminals too." And so the court said, "Yes, don't do that anymore. You don't
go through special.
Yeah, you don't have to do anything specialized for these defense lawyers." And so there's a lot of different things that they did to try to keep people safe in the situation, because these people were, as I said, very sophisticated, and they had a lot of money behind them with this $400,000 floating around. and just had an experience with killing people. And again, we didn't indict everybody who could have indicted, and they had other non-indicted co-conspirators and family members and such who were upset. And they, like I said, when we found these two shoplifting gals, for example, they talked about how they were, the group was planning on certain things, dreaming up perjury and things like that for people to provide in the defense case. So there was a lot of security involved in the case.
Yeah, those RICO trials are not easy.
Yeah, they're complicated. The RICO statute itself is very complex. It allows for a lot of evidence to come in about people who were professional criminals, and they set up these enterprises. And it's a wide statute that has all kinds of possibilities for white-collar crime and fraud and all sorts of things. But obviously, it also has a role to play with respect to drug dealing, weapons, murders, things like that. And you can bring in violations of many state laws as part of your federal case through the RICO statute. It's a very useful statute, and we're lucky to have a statute like that on the books.
Well, Michael, I really appreciate you coming on with me, and I know it wasn't an easy decision. Hopefully to have you back on some other cases.
Oh, maybe so. Okay.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care. Bye.